I think that truth is unknowable unless it is embodied in the historical process.
Yeah, I don't think that.
No, I know you don't. And that's the big difference between us. There are certain perennial problems that are constantly haunting our civilization. One of those problems is, are we free? Do we have real agency? The answers given to this question have been what many people feel are reductionist, mechanistic, and reduce the human person to something like an automaton. It's a problem because most people intuit that it's simply not true. They instinctively reason that there is something about this view of the human being that sweeps the rug from under the feet of any claims we might make about human dignity and the importance of the kind of civilizations that we have built over many centuries. There's one philosopher who has offered a very different response. My dear friend, Professor Thomas Pink, he has worked on questions of free will, on the historical genealogy of how we've come to certain assumptions about who we are, about the degree to which we can say we have real agency. We seem to be in rapid civilizational decay. And one of the symptoms of this, it seems to me, is a reductionist account of human nature and what it is to be a human agent, to think of us almost exclusively as automatons. And this is a view of human beings that seems to be fomented by very prominent philosophers in the Western Academy, and there are a number of very well-known analytic philosophers who are aggressively defending such a view of human agency. And you have worked for many years now on the question of free will, but you take a very different view. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes. I think the central notion to understanding this intellectual debate is the notion of power. So I'm taking a slightly different tack from people who think that the big issue is necessarily to do with materialism or immaterialism. I don't deny that that is an issue, but I think a more fundamental question is whether human life involves kinds of power, the operations of kinds of force that are very unlike the kind of force you find in general nature. Now, by power or force, I mean the capacity to produce or prevent an outcome. So it's a very general notion. And one obvious case of power or force is what we might call ordinary causation. So if I take a brick and I hurl it at a window and the window breaks, that's a very familiar case of the operation of a capacity to produce an outcome. The brick has this capacity when hurled against the window to produce the outcome that the window breaks.
So are you using ordinary causation as a synonym for efficient causation?
Well, efficient causation in general nature.
Right.
Because there are, as we'll see, there are conceptions of efficient causation that aren't like that at all.
Right.
Efficient causation is an Aristotelian term which has been taken on board by early modern naturalistic philosophers as the one bit of Aristotle they were happy with.
Yeah.
But in doing that, they very greatly narrowed the notion. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to call it ordinary causation. It's the sort of thing that someone like Thomas Hobbes had in mind when he thought of causation and when he used the term efficient causation. In his case, it was bound up with materialism. It was one motion in matter producing or preventing another motion in matter. But you could apply this notion if you believed in immaterial substances as well. What this involves is the same kind of power as bricks hitting windows, and in particular a tendency to associate the kind of power with determination in a way that involves necessity. So the more of the power you have, the more you have the operation of the power bearer approximating to something automatic or cog-like, like something in a machine. So suppose you've got a really weighty brick. It's got as much power or force as you can imagine a brick having, and I chuck it at the window, then of necessity the brick will operate to break the window.
Yeah.
If it's chancy whether the brick will break the window or not, that will be a mark of a lack of force on the brick's part.
Yes.
So we've got a notion of power or force where the more of it you have, the more you approximate to a kind of necessitation.
So is it fair to say that the unexamined assumption behind this framework of power is that the mechanistic metaphor has an explanatory power for how everything works, including organisms as complex as you and me?
It's once you've got this notion of power or force in play, then as it increases in its extent, so nature will approach to a mechanical system where every state of it is necessitated by a prior state of it. Exactly. And that will cover obviously a whole wide range of views about mechanism in other respects. You know, some people will be atomists, some people might be dualists. They might think of some matter coexisting with immaterial spirit, but they will still be deploying the same conception of necessitating force, where the lack of the force is associated with chanciness. And chanciness is a sign of lack of force. So this is sort of underlying notion is one that in the early modern period people tried to make apply to human nature as well. And obviously it gave rise to particular problems in relation to two areas of human life. One is in relation to the idea of freedom, because it's not clear how the operation of this necessitating power is consistent with human freedom. Yeah. And the other, I suppose, is in connection with motivation, what moves us to act, because it looks as though it's associating the motivation of human action with some sort of mechanical process. And that in particular is not obviously consistent with the idea that we are capable of reason.
Right.
Because it looks as though we're just very, very complex mechanisms.
Completely deterministically ordered.
Yes. Yeah. One question that the early modern period in philosophy does raise is whether this assimilation of all power to necessitating ordinary causation is right, because it looks as though we think of human life, particularly in ways that matter to ethics, as involving two forms of power that don't seem to be features of wider nature. One is the idea of freedom as a kind of power to determine things for ourselves. So that's a power that we ourselves possess, that we immediately exercise in and through over our actions, and involves, in the way we immediately think about it, the availability of alternatives. Yeah. So I determine for myself what I do, and that's involved with the thought that there's more than one possibility in relation to what I might do, and I control or determine for myself which possibility I go in for, whether I raise my hand or lower it. So that's the idea of self-determination, involving some availability of alternatives, and immediately one thinks of this availability of alternatives as involving some sort of contingency.
Yes.
It's contingent which alternative I go for. And that obviously involves tension with the idea of necessity, which excludes contingency by its very nature. That's one thought. That's one kind of power of self-determination. Then the other kind of power is one associated with our capacity for reason. And it's the idea of a reason or justification, the sort of thing that we might advance in an argument with ourselves or with somebody else to persuade them to form a belief, arrive at a conclusion, or to take a decision. This idea of a kind of justification as having a power to move us to believe or to do what is justified. And this again seems not to be a form of power we associated with wider forms of mechanism involving non-rational nature. It seems something that we're responsive to, the kind of power that we're responsive to, through our capacity for thought, and in particular through our capacity to entertain objects of thought. So, unlike the power of self-determination, this is a power we're subject to, but it's not like some past event operating through a mechanism on us, like a genetic condition we were born with, or some drug we've been fed, or a brick hitting us on the head. It's a power that operates on us when we deliberate or reason about what to think or what to do. And what we deliberate about when we reason about what to think or about what to do involve objects of our thought.
And these act on the intellect, to insist on Aristotelian language again, these act on the intellect like final causes.
Well, they might act like final causes. They might, in fact, I'll come back to this notion of an efficient cause, but understood more widely.
Right.
They might operate as an efficient cause, and I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But what's happening is you're wondering what to believe. Did the butler do it?
Sure.
Or was it the housemaid? So you've got these alternative claims, either of which you might end up believing. At the moment, they're just propositions or claims about matters of fact that you're entertaining in your mind's eye, so to speak, and you contemplate them, and you contemplate them in relation to the evidence, whatever kind of evidence applies, and one of them you end up believing, or perhaps you don't believe either, you just remain in doubt. And we've got the idea of a justification as a kind of power or force related to this object of thought, coming in the form of evidence or proof if it's a mathematical claim, that moves you to the extent that the evidence is convincing to believe it. Or if there's an absence of this justification, then nothing moves you to believe it and you remain in doubt.
And you have alluded to the fact in the past that even our language conveys this idea. So we talk about arguments being compelling, or argument. You know, that was a very powerful case that he made. You know, we speak as if these objects of the mind have a certain causal power over us.
Exactly. We talk about the force of an argument.
The force of an argument, exactly. Yeah.
And late scholasticism uses the Latin term vis when talking about this force, and they mean by it a force, something that's productive of outcomes. The outcome being that you form a mental state that modern philosophers call a psychological attitude, because it's an attitude you take to an object of thought.
Yeah.
A cognitive attitude in the case of belief, or a practical attitude in the case of a decision to do something. And we can have exactly the same phenomenon arising in relation to practical decisions as we've been discussing in relation to belief. So you're trying to persuade me, you're an estate agent, say, to buy a house, and you will present me with the option of buying that house. At the moment it's just an object of my thought. I may or may not ever do it. And I contemplate this option that I buy the house, and I see it as having aspects that are good or desirable, and other aspects that are less good and desirable. And the better it is, the more I feel compelled to decide on it. It becomes an offer that it's very hard for me as a rational person to refuse, if it really would be the most sensible thing to do, to buy that house. And again, we have an attractive force of goodness, the goodness of buying that house, that initially moves me to want to buy it, and then may lead me to decide to buy it.
So is this why Aquinas, in his discourse on the fall of the angels, what we would call demons in Christian theology, what Aquinas argues is that God must have disclosed to the angels that he was going to make available to them the beatific vision before they had it, and because were they just given the beatific vision, they would not be able to then refuse it. But he said that he would, or disclosed to them that this would be made available to them, and what Aquinas argues is that the demons and the devil, that he, how does he put it? That when he realised that the beatific vision wasn't his by nature, but was going to be something gratuitous, it was going to be a gift, he saw that as an assault on his dignity. And his pride was what caused him to turn away. So this seems to be this theological idea or explanation of the fall of the angels that Aquinas gives seems to speak to the point you're making. The beatific vision would have such causal power on the angelic mind that it would then be impossible to refuse. But because it wasn't disclosed yet, it didn't have that power. It didn't compel them.
That's an absolutely excellent illustration of theological dimension of the theory, but also illustrates very nicely how it involves power. So in the modern free will problem, philosophers tend to think that the only power in nature is ordinary, what I've called ordinary efficient causation. So you either have power to the maximal extent, which then imposes necessity, or if you reduce that power, you have an absence of power and pure chance. What we have is an earlier version in Aquinas of the free will problem that is precisely framed around different conceptions of different forms of power that are specific to rational nature.
Right.
So, and both so we're going to look at the free will problem as involving a problem about the conditions under which we can exercise a very distinctive power of our own, a power involving contingency over alternatives. And at the same time, there are going to be a variety of other kinds of power that might threaten it. Mm-hmm. One might be ordinary causation, operating through mechanism. The other might be the power of something like goodness or truth or some other form of reason involving power, or something transcending reason, grace, I'll come back to that, which would operate on us through our own thought, and objects of our thought, like the beatific vision when it's made available to us, which is an object of our mental state. We enjoy vision.
Right.
And that could involve also the imposition on us of necessity, but necessity not coming from a kind of necessitating mechanism, but rather necessity coming through an object of our thought, but based on a kind of value.
Right.
So goodness attracts us, and infinite goodness might attract us in a way that removed our capacity to refuse or to go another way.
But Aquinas has this sort of paradoxical position, which is that when something is so good that it greatly inhibits our capacity to opt for something else, when we opt for that thing, our freedom is actually increased. So for Aquinas, the souls in heaven cannot opt for anything other than God. Their joy is to contemplate God for all eternity. And yet for Aquinas, they have a kind of infinite freedom, because for him, freedom is conjoined to the good, and interior slavery is conjoined to a turning away from the good. That's actually, I think, what he considers vice to be, a kind of slavery to disordered impulses.
That's right, but it seems to involve a certain paradox, but actually I think one can resolve the tension in the following way, because one can distinguish between freedom simply as a conception of a kind of power involving contingency. And of course, in relation to the beatific vision, the vision removes the contingency that will refuse it.
Sure.
So in that sense, it removes a form of contingent power. At the same time, or we never had the contingent power in relation to that object in the first place. But we can also look at freedom not simply as a notion of a contingency evolving power, but as a notion of its perfection. And here we come to a slightly different idea of freedom, which is the idea of freedom as a state or condition of liberation.
Indeed, yeah.
Which is then related to the power as its perfection. And here, of course, the beatific vision is precisely liberation to its fullest extent.
Yes.
So, but it perfects the very power that involves contingency as its very nature, because it removes all possibility of our employing this contingency involving power in a way that is degrading or that goes against its proper function.
Right, right.
Anyway, that's the direction which I would resolve that tension.
Fine.
But
that conception of freedom is, you can reconcile it to the account that you're giving.
Yes, I think so. But it's very important that what removes the contingency in this case is not simply a mechanism, but rather a kind of value operating on us through our thought.
Sure.
As through a kind of mental object. And this means that before the time of Hobbes, before the early modern slimming down of the theory of power to a very narrow conception of mechanical efficient causation, the free will problem had a far greater complexity. Because, as I say, freedom was enjoyed by us as a distinctive form of power, and there was more than one kind of power imposing necessity that could threaten it. Mm-hmm. One would be ordinary efficient causation operating through wider nature. The other could be a kind of force of reason, or some analogue of reason at the supernatural level. So, but aside from the theological dimension, it's very, very important that we have a natural conception of rationality as involving the operation on us of a power to which our capacity for rationality makes us susceptible. So, a bunny rabbit or a stone, the power of reason passes them by. They're not affected by it.
Sure.
They're subject to mechanical forms of force, but not this power of reason.
Which we call instinct. They're just acting instinctively.
Or through, gravity operates on
them.
Right. Lots of forms of mechanical force operates on them as they operate on us, but we have this peculiar susceptibility to the force of reason. And the more reasonable or rational we are, the more susceptible we are to the force of reason as a force acting on us. And that's really very distinctive, because it seems to involve a very distinctive mode of operation that's purely psychological, and parts of nature that don't share our psychology are immune to the force.
Sure.
Now, when I say that we've got this very natural conception of rationality as involving this kind of force, coming from a kind, well, it's a force operating not only on us through objects of our thought, but it seems to be a kind of force involving a distinctive or set of distinctive values. In the case of belief, the value seems to be truth. And we talk of evidence as evidence of truth. We think of evidence which carries this force of justification in relation to belief as evidence of truth. Proofs are proofs of truth. So that's the force that operates on our intellect to get us to believe things. It's a force of truth. In the case of practical decisions, it's a force of goodness or desirability. Now that means that we've got at least two values in play now, truth and goodness. They seem to differentiate or create a basis for distinguishing two kinds of forces of reason, at least. And we've got at least two aspects of our psychology that are peculiarly susceptible to these forces. And the intellect looks as though it's going to be receptive to the force of truth. The will, it's very natural to think, is susceptible to the force of goodness. One could then develop quite a sophisticated theory, perhaps, of the intellect as a psychological faculty and its relation to the force of truth, and of the will as a psychological faculty and its relation to the force of goodness. And we could discuss how far these forces involve contingency, how far they involve necessity, under what conditions they would be necessitating. And you would have something like the discussion of human psychology, its relation to reason, in Francisco Suarez's Metaphysical Disputations. So
what I've got from what you've said so far is that there is a highly reductionist account of human freedom, which presupposes a mechanistic conception of how we operate in the world. You've highlighted a couple of times, which I think we need to go more deeply into, that Thomas Hobbes is really the culprit here, and that prior to Hobbes there was actually a much richer account of human freedom and the relationship of freedom to our reasoning capacities, and that there are certain thinkers at the time of Hobbes and after Hobbes who are sort of late scholastic thinkers who recognise early on where this reductionist account is going, and they push back against it.
Yes, I think in many ways they kind of ignore it.
Right.
So I think, I mean, someone like Suarez is a thinker who's writing before Hobbes. Hobbes is not really a problem for him, because to a large extent the skeptics about human freedom that he's arguing against, he anticipates as working within more or less the same sort of framework as he's working with. He's not really identified the reductionist program fully. But I think it's very important that the reductionist program radically changes the nature of the free will problem once it starts taking centre stage. Here's an example. If you read any modern book on the free will problem, you'll often see as a central puzzle about freedom the following dilemma. There are two possibilities. One, that all our actions be explicable. But then, if they're explicable, they are the product of necessitating power.
Mm-hmm.
If they're not the product of necessitating power, then there's nothing left but an absence of power or pure chance, which means that they're not really explicable fully because they're just random events. So we've got this sort of...
So that's determinism and compatibilism?
Well, the alternatives are determinism and explicability,
right,
or pure randomness and chance.
Right.
And neither seem very, very intuitive cases of human freedom,
mm-hmm.
Because we normally think of freedom as kind of explicable, not chance, but on the other hand, not necessitated either.
Sure.
The view of power as just mechanical doesn't give you that middle option. It just gives you the options either of necessity or pure chance. But of course, that's just the effect of this very, very narrow conception of all powers by its very nature moving towards necessitation. Mm-hmm. Where you don't have necessitation, you have just an absence of power, i.e. pure chance. On this earlier conception of the free will problem, where you have, for example, the idea of freedom as a kind of distinctive power of self-determination, you could have the following as a possibility. Our actions are not pure chance, they're determined by us, but it's up to us how we determine them. So our determination of them involved contingency as part of as an aspect of the power. So we've got a kind of power, the operation of which doesn't involve necessity at all, but by its very nature leaves it up to us how the power is exercised. So the nature of the power is to involve contingency. Contingency, or understood simply as an absence of necessity, doesn't necessarily imply chance at all. It can leave room for a different kind of power that determines the outcome, a power that is not mechanical and leaves its operation up to its possessor. That idea of power as determining, but determining in a contingent way and not a mechanical way, is something we've just lost. It's been abandoned once you insist there's only one kind of power in nature, a power that by its very nature operates through necessity.
But the problem is still there, because the deterministic account, what it seems to do is not explain a whole realm of how we operate with each other, how we operate in the world, how we make political decisions, how we make long-term decisions. And so what people seem to do is just say, well, there is all of that aspect of the human world which we'll just pretend doesn't exist so that we can continue to give our mechanistic explanation. And it seems what you're doing is saying, well, no, actually, we need some account of human freedom and human agency that accounts for all of these aspects as well.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think we want to give an account of human life as not simply involving either necessity or mere chance. What is very, very interesting about the new model of all power as ordinary causation that operates through the necessity is that it did involve attempts to reconstruct ethical life and political life, and indeed the theory of rationality itself, in a way that did without these special powers that were peculiar to rational nature, like a power of self-determination or a power of reason to move us. And so what's very important about thinkers like Hobbes and his successors is that they don't deny that we live an ethical life, or that the state exists, or that humans are distinctively rational, but they try and reconstruct these notions to involve nothing more than a purely mechanistic idea of power as operating through necessity. And these reconstructions are highly sophisticated and very interesting, and they've come to dominate a lot of modern philosophy.
Your position seems, if I've understood you correctly, to put a lot of weight on the importance of argumentation. That if you can present a reasoned case to somebody, then you can present something that will have causal power over the mind of that person, will compel them to accept a worldview that you think approximates the truth more than the one perhaps they already have. And so you can move people towards the good and the true through a dialectic.
Yes.
Traditionally, conservatives like me, we have put a lot of emphasis on what you might call sort of pre-reasoned principles. So it seems to me that the kind of affection one might have for their nation, what you might call patriotism or national loyalty, that the reasons that you have for national loyalty or patriotic affection, the reasons you have are sort of post hoc. You have this affection that you're that others actually try to cultivate in you from a very young age, and you stand up at the national anthem, or you watch the Jubilee on the television or whatever it is, and then it's only when somebody challenges the affection that you have. And you find other examples of this affection one has for one's parents or whatever. And it's only when someone challenges it that you then realise you have to look around for arguments that you think are compelling arguments. So how does that sort of pre-reasoned affection, what role does that play in the case that you're making? Or does it at all?
I think it can. And I think that one shouldn't assume that the pre-reasoned affection is not a response to reason in its own right.
Sure.
So I think to see there is a strong association of a certain sort of conservatism that appeals to the affections with a suspicion of reason, particularly reason in a way that's in a form that's associated with abstraction.
So certainly in the 18th century, conservatism, explicitly arose to challenge assumptions surrounding the rationalist movement.
Yes.
So I'm guessing that's what you're alluding to.
Yes. So I think to understand this, one has to look again at the models of reason that are being brought in to supplant the account of rationality as susceptibility to the force of truth and goodness that I've been discussing so far.
Yes.
So I've been discussing in the medieval tradition, we've been looking at Aquinas' deployment of this notion of reason or rationality as involving a susceptibility to a kind of force of a value operating on us through objects of our thought. We could use a general term for this as a sort of kind of normative power, because it's the power of a normative value of some sort to work on us. What do people who don't believe in this kind of power do to explain human rationality? How do they replace it? Because people like Hobbes can see that we aren't like bunny rabbits, that we are reasoning beings, that we debate and deliberate in a way that animals can't.
Yeah.
But they don't want to say that we are susceptible to a kind of power that passes the animals by. They need to integrate a theory of our distinctive rationality into a wider metaphysics of powers as purely mechanical. So what do? They think that reasoning simply involves the operation of ordinary causation that takes us from one mental state to another mental state in a way that simply involves mental states being subject to and themselves exercising mechanical power. You could look at the starting mental states as things like beliefs in a set of premises, and then those will produce, through necessitating causation, belief in a conclusion. Or if we're looking at practical reasoning, we could look at the whole process as starting off with a set of appetites for ends, and then they will lead through fairly mechanical processes to appetites for believed means to those ends. And then we arrive at desires or decisions to adopt those means. So we're going to develop a model of rationality as simply involving our moving from one set of mental states to another set of mental states by fairly simple
linear
methods that can be encapsulated in general rules of reasoning. That will tend to lead us to try and subsume rationality under very, very general principles. It might be very general principles about how to further our self-interest if we're Thomas Hobbes. Or if we're utilitarians, they might be principles about how to maximize a sum total of pleasure, and so on and so forth. So those will be very, very abstract principles. They will not leave a lot of room for particular sentiments or affections. They will not certainly leave any room for looking at those particular sentiments or affections as involving our responsiveness to complex cases of the good that are not susceptible to regimentation in terms of these general structures. And that will tend to lead to a disassociation of the particular sentiments from a general theory of reason.
Right.
And therein lies the problem.
Right.
And of course, if one is a sort of post-Enlightenment conservative who values the particular sentiments or affections for very good reasons, one may, of course, tend to value these sentiments or affections in a way that detaches them from reason and that sees the life of reason as a danger to them, as threatening to them.
Yeah.
But that's a mistake. That's a big mistake.
Yes.
And it's very much associated with a radical change in the epistemology of reason. Go back to the model of reason as involving the operation on us of normative power. One of the cues that our rationality should leave us open to is precisely a force operating on us through an object of our thought to move us to believe it, to want it, to decide on it. This is a kind of force for which post-Enlightenment theories of rationality have no place. But it is going to be a cue that there might be some important value that general models of reason has bypassed, but which actually is a genuine value coming to us from without, to which we should respond.
Because presumably if truth is, very broadly speaking, the correspondence of the judgments of your intellect to the way things actually are, then if the flourishing of human nature is, if you like, human nature's correspondence to reality, then the way things actually are the things for which you should have affection. And so the pursuit of truth and the right order of affectivity you would expect to always be a sort of integrated principles of human action, right?
One would hope so.
Well,
I mean,
but then it's interesting. Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question because initially, we have a conception of truth and goodness as operating on us as kinds of power. It's going to be a further question whether these powers are going to operate in a way that's fundamentally and ultimately harmonious or not. And there's a sense in which one shouldn't rule out at the very start, just when thinking about this conception of rationality as involving the operation on us of forms of power, one shouldn't rule out the very possibility of tragic conflicts.
Yeah.
For example, between one kind of good and another kind of good.
Yes.
Or between truth as a value to which our intellect is responsive, and goodness as another value in which the intellectual life, of course, is involved as well.
It is interesting that Aquinas argues that whilst it's true that goodness, truth, being, and he arguably includes beauty, although there are passages in his thought that that are in conflict on this issue, but that these are convertible with one another, and therefore in themselves ought not to be in conflict. But part of the way that a mind works is that it can abstract from the concrete realities the good, the true, and the beautiful, and abstract them in such a way as they can actually be in conflict. The example that I have used in the past is the example of the beauty of Bathsheba. She really was very beautiful, and her beauty really was very good. This is all true, and so it's not as if King David was mistaken in his judgments when he saw Bathsheba, but those judgments had been, if you like, isolated from the entire moral context in which he had encountered her. And this seems to be, if you like, something inherently problematic about the way that a mind that has the capacity for abstraction, this is something inherently problematic about it.
Yes, I mean, whether it's just to do with abstraction, after all, one of the distinctive features of goodness is that it can come in many forms and aspects. And for Thomas, of course, that is part of how human freedom in the practical sphere is possible, in a way that wouldn't be true if the only value which we're responding to was truth. Because we will always have, in this life, short of a beatific vision, a range of alternative options, each of which will be in various different ways good to a degree, which will conflict with each other.
Yes.
At a very basic level, we can't go for all of them.
Yes, absolutely.
But that, of course, is something we appreciate at the very concrete and particular level.
Yes.
So I think you're right that conflict can arise in a way that's hard to resolve at the level of the abstract, but it can also arise at the level of the particular and concrete as well.
So why do you think it is that the liberal moral tradition, which seems to have very much accommodated the more mechanistic conceptions of human agency, why do you think it is that tradition has opted for a sort of optimism that says, well, no, you can have it all. If you self-author your existence in this completely emancipated, morally emancipated, civilizationally emancipated way, you can have it all. You can. The typical example is the young woman who's told that she can get married, have as many children as she wants, and also be a CEO of a big company, and also, you know, you can have it all. And there are an increasing number of women who are coming forward and saying, well, actually, no, what ended up happening is I wasn't there for my children, or I didn't get the promotions that I wanted, or I didn't. Whereas the conservative tradition has always insisted that, look, this place is traditionally considered a valley of tears. You know, there's always this tragic, melancholic aspect to our lives here on Earth. And that's something that you have to reconcile yourself to, and not something that you have to constantly strive against.
Well, I'm not sure that actually liberalism is always so reconciling. I mean, Isaiah Berlin was I think a liberal, and of course his liberalism was based on the idea of a tragic conflict between different kinds of goods.
But he was also the great champion of negative liberty.
Well, yes, but of course one of the reasons why he was so suspicious of theories of positive liberty was that they appeared to be programs by which some reconciling perfect state of liberation was going to be imposed on people.
Yes, he thought they were fascistic.
Yes.
Yeah.
So one way you can be a liberal is to place a lot of importance on liberty as an absence of things being imposed on you, that precisely involves avoiding trying to resolve irresolvable conflicts between goods. In a sense, a lot of theological programs have been, unlike the more skeptical forms of conservatism, programs that do promise ultimate resolution to conflicts. I mean, I think that the awareness that we all have of rationalities involving the operation on us of various kinds of force can be appreciated non-theologically, and then it could go in a number of directions, but it also can be appreciated theologically, and that will involve two dimensions. One is the thought that there will be an ultimate reconciliation, a guarantee of harmony between all these various cases of force that impel us to think and decide in various ways. But the other is, of course, something that we touched on in the discussion of Aquinas and the bad angels, which is the importance of this conception of rationality as involving the operation on us of a kind of force, and the theory and the theology of grace. So grace involves the idea of an elevation of human nature above its natural capacity. And what's that going to involve? Well, if the operation of human nature at its normal level involves a susceptibility to a kind of power, surely its elevation to a supernatural level will also involve a susceptibility to a kind of power, an analogue of reason, the power of reason for that higher level. And that, of course, is the power of grace. And that brings us back again to the pride of the fallen angels, because of course they wanted to be as gods. They didn't want to be governed by a power coming to them from without that might impose necessity on them.
Interesting.
But that, of course, is our fate. We share with God a capacity for rationality. God does things for reasons, just as we do things for reasons. But we are capable of reason as created beings, not as a creator. So our capacity for reason involves our bearing an image of God without being gods ourselves. And that's going to involve our goodness playing a role in our life that involves us being subject to power in a way that it doesn't have any analogue in God's life.
But this also brings us back quite interestingly to the role of the affections, of affectivity, because Aquinas says in his account of how we come to believe, he says that the articles of the faith, or the propositions that we assent to, are not themselves compelling. They don't compel the intellect. You know, the God is triune. The second person of the Trinity incarnated and worked as a carpenter, and then died as a criminal and resurrected. There are plenty of well-meaning people of goodwill, as we would say, who will hear these propositions and say, I'm not moved to believe any of that. And in fact, you know, you might say, well, look, here's the Old Testament, it all testifies to this. Well, you know, some of it does, but there are a lot of well-meaning Jews out there who read the Old Testament and say, well, no, I don't come to that conclusion. Now, Aquinas, his argument is that how is it that very thoughtful, intelligent, reasoning people come to assent to these propositions? He says, well, God enters the soul by prevenient grace. He establishes what Aquinas calls, or how it's translated in the English, a sympathy between him and the soul, so that when you know, somebody starts delivering the message of the gospel to you, you sort of say, well, yes, I suppose that does sound like God, right? Well, what on earth justifies you saying, well, that does sound like God? Well, God is already operating in the depth of the heart, and he's created this affection for him. I mean, it's a bit like there are a lot of things that people will only believe in the context of friendship, right? You trust the testimony of that person because you've come to enjoy time with that person, you see the world in the same way, and so forth. There seems to be something analogous going on with assent to the propositions of the faith. So in Aquinas' account, it's not simply the intellect that is moved, or even moved first. And Aquinas goes so far as to say the will moves the intellect, and that's how you come to believe. Now, there are two ways of understanding that. If you read some of the sort of 19th century seminary manuals, they have a very Hobbesian way of understanding the will moving the intellect as a kind of mechanism on that forces it to accept something that otherwise it would reject. But there's another way of understanding that, which I think is a more humane way, which is that that through relationship we come to see the goodness in somebody, and therefore can accept his testimony, even if otherwise we would be not so inclined to accept it.
Yeah, this is a very interesting issue. I think that just on the point of a mechanistic view of the relationship between the will and the intellect, I think that's highly debatable, and I'm rather unsympathetic, as I think you are too, to that sort of mechanistic conception.
Sure.
It doesn't look as though, on the whole, beliefs are things we can form just on the basis of deciding to form them.
Indeed.
For obvious reasons.
Forcing ourselves to do it.
I mean, I can't just decide to believe the Battle of Hastings took place in 1065. And,
right, yeah.
It's just not going to work.
Yeah.
You can offer me money and I won't be able to do it. On the other hand, what may be true is that belief, the operation of the intellect, in a way that's connected with having some control over it, can be sensitive to goodness in a form that's conditional on truth. Mm-hmm. So I can't just believe something without being moved by at least the appearance of truth. But truth may move me in a way that also involves the immense goodness of recognizing that truth.
Right.
and understanding the recognition of truth as involving a very valuable form of goodness, a profound flourishing on my part, may precisely involve my understanding the recognition of the truth as involving me in a relationship with a witness or someone who I come to recognize and relate to through recognizing the truth. Then goodness moves me as well as truth.
But I'm suggesting that the relationship is prior to the acceptance. That actually there's something going on here where the mind isn't simply compelled by the force of the object, but actually the mind recognizes something in the source of the object, which also moves the mind.
That may be so. I would be more inclined to think of it as an appreciation of the truth coming with an appreciation of the goodness of responding to the truth.
So this windmill, which is only a stone's throw from the cafe we were just chatting at, was built in 1627. It's the oldest windmill in the country, and it was operating as a working windmill until 1922.
Well, this is a very fine 17th century mechanism.
It's a Hobbseian structure.
It's a Hobbseian structure, yes.
So here, I want to ask you a little more about Hobbes, because it seems to me that the classic story that people tell about Thomas Hobbes was that he was the first to give this idea of the pre-social individual, that the fundamental cell of a state is, if you like, the insulated atomic individual, and that we have, as he famously argued, a sort of brutish, horrible nature, and we're constantly at each other's throats, and so in order to remain safe and in order to enjoy our lives to any degree, we essentially have to be subordinated to some Leviathan state, as he called it, that would keep us all under control. That's the classic tale that people tell, but it seems to me that you're saying, well, actually, hold on, there's a very important epistemological case that Hobbes is making, which is, if you like, a precondition for the political claims that he wants to make. Is that correct?
Well, he is both a very important natural philosopher as well as a political theorist. And what he's wanting to do is to reconstruct how the theory of how states actually work to fit his new theory, uniform theory of power, as always just necessitating ordinary causation. Central question for any political theory is to understand both how law moves us to conform and what its fundamental function is. Mm-hmm. So, what everyone can agree on is that when states pass laws, they're not just sounding off, they're actually wanting to produce outcomes.
Yeah.
The outcome, obviously, is that most people conform to the law. And that means there's going to be some process involving power from the making of legislation to people doing what the law says. And for Hobbes, it had to just be ordinary causation. What he was facing is a set of opponents, an earlier political theory that didn't think it was ordinary causation at all. They thought that when laws are passed, they actually move us with the force of reason, this force we were talking about earlier. And that was because they thought that we need legal authority, the authority of the state, not somehow to take us out of some state of potential conflict, but to give us an understanding of something we would not otherwise have understood, which is an understanding of the good for a complete human community. So if you're Suarez, or I think Aquinas actually, or Bellarmine or anyone like that, they think that as individuals we have an understanding of our own and other people's interests at a private level.
Yes.
Even the fall hasn't taken that away. So I can understand if you would benefit from having something, or if I would benefit from it, or whether some third party might need food or whatever. So we can understand people's interests. We can understand it from a not purely self-interested point of view, but still we've been understanding everything at a private level. What we wouldn't understand is the good for a complete human community that might involve other people with whom we have no direct personal connection.
The common good of a settled community.
A genuinely common good of a complete political community. We just don't have that. To have that, we would actually need political institutions.
Sure.
To extend our understanding of reason to include people not personally connected to us. And that's fundamentally the function of the state for this scholastic tradition. It's to enable us to understand a genuinely public good. And what the political institutions of the state do is communicate to us the force of truth and goodness for a complete human community.
And it doesn't just protect the common good through coercive measures, it also by virtue of coercive measures, teaches the community about the common good.
It delivers the understanding as a witness. It's a teaching witness to the common good.
And thereby render the members of that community virtuous?
Yes, indeed, in relation to the common good. So the state is going to be required even if it's not coercive. Coercion involves the threat of punishment. And that's a requirement for these political theorists that comes from the fall. But even if the fall had never occurred, it's a design feature of humans, they think, that to exist in a complete community we would need political institutions to direct us, and by directing us to communicate the understanding of the genuinely public good.
And among Christian thinkers, there's a long-standing conflict here, isn't there? I mean, there were certain, particularly among the church fathers, there were those who thought that had there been no fall, there would be no reason to have a state. And there were those who thought that even had sin never entered the world, man always would have had to organise himself in political communities.
And certainly these thinkers in late scholasticism that are immediately being opposed by Hobbes go with the thought that even if the fall had never taken place, we would still have needed the state to understand the genuine bond of community and to respond to it.
So what caused you to turn to the late scholastic thinkers? And you're talking about people like Suarez and Bellarmine here.
Yes.
So Anyone else that I should?
Well, Molyneux, of course, is a
Right.
very important political thinker as well.
So Salamanca, Valladolid, that
Yes,
whole school
yes.
in the 16th century.
Yes.
And what caused you to look into these thinkers in order to respond to the Hobbesian paradigm?
Well, because Hobbes was so clearly opposed to them.
Right.
About a fifth of Leviathan is directed against Bellarmine.
Yeah.
And they are not so much, I think, opposed to earlier medieval thinkers, but they're much more developed in the theories they're putting forward, so that lines of thought to be found implicitly in the High Middle Ages are developed much more explicitly and much more argumentatively by the late 16th, early 17th centuries. You can see this in the theories of grace and of the operation of reason, and in the theory of the state. You've just got much more sophisticatedly argumentative theories, and a certain variety of them as well.
Earlier you were talking about conservatism and some of the assumptions of conservatism. The early conservatives, these characters I've spent many years studying, and I did my own doctoral research on, people like Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre. Where would they fit in on this? I'm aware that Joseph de Maistre, he didn't go anywhere without his volume of the complete works of Robert Bellarmine, which he annotated the entire thing. I'm not sure if it still exists, but contemporaries at the time, talked about his constant, putting in of marginalia all over. He was fascinated by Bellarmine. Do you think that there is a link between 16th century Spanish scholasticism and the response to the Enlightenment of the early conservatives?
From some of the things you've told me about Maistre, I can see links. I think one very obvious difference that's very clear in someone like Burke is the absence in Burke of the same metaphysics of the psychological and its relation to value that you have in these thinkers.
Yes.
That removal of metaphysics of human nature as responsive to normative power is very much the effect of Hobbes on the English language tradition in philosophy.
Interesting.
So that by the time you get to even quite conservative in the small c sense, moralists like Joseph Butler, you will have a project of trying to defend a Christian theory of morals, but without the traditional scholastic Aristotelian psychological and metaphysical theory.
Yes. Yes.
A theory of the authority of conscience will take the place of the theory of truth and goodness as normative powers operative through a distinctive form of force.
Right.
So that has gone, and that means that the whole embedding of political theory within metaphysics has been transformed, and you've got something very different happening, I think.
Well, so this is very important because, as you know, I speak at a lot of conservative conferences. I'm very involved in conservative politics, both in the UK and throughout Europe. And what you're suggesting here is that in the sources of what we understand to be conservatism today, there may be something very serious missing here, that actually we've lost the primacy of the epistemological case in order to understand what a real polity is, what human flourishing might look like, and so we might be falling back on counterfeit arguments.
I think there's a big risk of that, and I think one thing that's likely to be lost is the theological dimension of our problem, because one of the things central to Hobbes's project was the removal of the church as a plausible sovereign legal authority. Hobbes wanted sovereign legal authority to take only one form, the form of the state. To that end, he reconceived what states do, or what legal authority does, to leave the state as the only plausible bearer of sovereign legal authority. So if you're early modern Catholic scholastic, you've got a general conception of how legal authority works. It's channeling and witnessing on behalf of normative power at various levels. The state witnesses and channels the power of truth and goodness at the level of nature, power of reason, in relation to the bonum commune. The church channels and witnesses to normative power at the level of the supernatural, the power of grace in relation to the final end, supernatural end. For Hobbes, all that the state is doing is acting as a coordinative device, channeling the force, ordinary causal force of people's appetites in such a way as to preclude conflict.
Yeah.
And to lead to mutually advantageous outcomes. Once you lose the metaphysics of normative power, you're very liable to see the state simply as a coordinative device.
As Locke does.
As Locke does, and as most modern legal theorists do.
Yeah.
Whether you're looking at John Finnis or Joseph Raz or Herbert Hart. That means a whole dimension of how states operate is lost to you, because I would argue that states actually do function as witnesses on behalf of truth and goodness.
Sure.
Perhaps defective ones, but witnesses all the same.
Yes, in fact, I think late modernity has made this rather clear, hasn't it? That the state, whilst claiming to be morally neutral and allow for each individual to come up with his own idea of what human flourishing looks like, what the good is, simultaneously wants to teach its members that there are many types of families, that sexual emancipation should have its own processions through the streets and its own flags, and the state is going to fund all of this. And so the state is still clearly viewing itself as having a didactic role of teaching its members what human flourishing looks like, what human purpose is, what the highest human achievements might be. It just seems to be working from very dubious principles in order to teach us these things.
Yes, and I think the lesson here is that all states will function broadly to do the same thing, which is to witness to the nature of the bonum commune. What they may, however, do is perform that function very badly.
Yes.
And at the same time, they may well foster a sort of false consciousness about what they're really doing. And so you will get a Millite myth about what states can do, let alone what they should do, which is rules out this didactic role, despite the fact that this is a role that states will always actually perform.
So what you're actually saying is that the nature of the state hasn't changed. What the state is today is what the state always was. It's just that today the state isn't honest about it.
Yes, I think that's right. Or certainly until recently it's not been honest about it. One issue that's central to this problem is the issue of the regulation of belief. Mm-hmm. If you think that states are in the business of witnessing to truth and goodness in relation to the bonum commune, the function of legal direction is to perform this witnessing function, then one of the things that perhaps legal direction might do is regulate belief itself. And that might not be a problem at all. So when the state witnesses to the nature of property, it can do a number of things. It could regulate simply whether you steal or not, but in doing that, try and teach you that refraining from stealing is very important because property really matters. But it might even start trying to regulate people's beliefs about property. Mm-hmm. In the past, of course, one thing that the state thought was really important was religion, and so it would actually try and regulate what people thought about religion. Now, in regulating belief, it's not trying simply to utter threats. If you don't believe that certain things, we will whack you, because on its own, just issuing commands to believe something won't have much effect. Yeah. I can't just order you to believe that the Battle of Hastings took place in 1065 and threaten you with punishment if you don't believe that. That won't do any good at all. But what I can do is use legal regulation to present something to you as true, mm-hmm. and to present the recognition of that truth as really important to the community. In the early modern period, the state presented religious claims as very important things for people to believe.
And in England, up until the late 19th century, the state was saying, I'm sorry, you cannot have an elite university education in this country unless you're a communicant member of the Church of England. Yes. Clearly that was the state saying, we hold this to be true and we don't think you're entitled to this kind of very elite education. I think it was Oxford, Cambridge and Durham, I think, were the three universities. Unless you believed these things and also practiced this religion.
And obviously the regulation of family structure through marriage law is about presenting as true certain claims about the family.
Yes.
And almost all states have marriage law, the function of which is to communicate a set of claims about the true nature of family structure. Now, of course, nowadays we have something very, very like the religiously regulative heresy laws of the past on the continent, which are Holocaust denial laws, which are about presenting as true the claim that the Holocaust actually happened, presenting it not only as true, but as a truth that it's very important people recognise and certainly not publicly deny for the good of the entire community. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing modern continental states returning to something very like the heresy laws of the past, but now as part of a project of defending certain beliefs about the very recent past as true in a way to resolve ethnic prejudice and tension within the modern state.
And do you think that progressive hate speech legislation is operating on similar principles?
Very obviously so, I think. So to punish certain crimes as hate crimes is to present certain ideals about interhuman relations as obviously true and very importantly true for the good of the community.
Saying a so-called trans woman is really a man?
That could be one of the purported claims that is going to be presented as true. Yeah. Now, these claims might or might not actually be true, but all states will be in the business of presenting certain views about how humans should relate to each other, particularly in relation to family structures. It will present a favoured consensus. The consensus will change over time, but the presentation of some sort of consensus or other in relation to family structure and a clear absence of toleration of deviant views in relation to that consensus. That's something that goes on all the time. It's a fairly constant feature of human political life.
But what you're saying is quite radical in the, if you like, the broader conservative debate, because there are very popular political scientists and theorists at the moment, and I'm thinking of people like Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule and people like this who say, look, the liberal state, the post-Hobbesian state, is a new kind of thing. It's a new, it's an invention of modernity. But what you're saying is, no, it's contiguous with what we have always understood a state to be. It's just operating in a radically different way because it presupposes false principles.
Absolutely. There's no such thing as a Hobbesian state.
Mm-hmm.
The Hobbesian state is a fiction. There's only states as they actually function. States as were correctly understood by people like Suarez and Bellarmine or Aquinas, so they may well misfunction as states of that kind by witnessing to falsehood as opposed to truth.
So this is a hopeful message, presumably. This means that what we've got at the moment, this malfunctioning state, is nonetheless the state as it always was, and therefore could be salvaged, at least potentially.
It might be, provided we don't lose sight of the true nature of the problem. I think that one of the difficulties affecting Catholic thought in this area in particular has been the secularization, even within Catholicism, of the true nature of the problem. Historically, Catholics have always understood that what's gone wrong in modern human life is the fall. What we get in a lot of modern Catholic thought, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, is the replacement of that vivid conception of the fall as the problem with some other story. It could be a Deneen-style story of the appearance of a post-Hobbesian state with a supposed atomization of the people in relation to that state, something I don't think has actually happened at all. Or it could be a sort of MacIntyre-style story, clearly taken out of Hegel, of the loss of the world of the traditional Greek polis and its replacement by a non-traditional world. Well, these are not correct accounts of the problem. After all, the traditional Greek polis was as much an inhabitant of the fallen world as we are.
Sure.
If we have problems nowadays leading the moral life, that isn't because we've lost sight of some traditional society that defined moral notions for us. It's because, as we always have been, even in ancient Greek times, we are still fallen. And if states misfunction or fail to do well the task that they always have done and still attempt to do, that's because of the fall. And if anything in particular has exacerbated the problem, it is of course the de-Christianization of the state, which isn't it suddenly turning into a Hobbesian state. It's the reason why the state does what it always was trying to do, witnessing to the bonum commune, but doing it rather badly, because it's become detached from the communication of grace through the church. One of the functions of which is to heal misfunctioning reason and to facilitate its proper operation at the level of nature.
Well, like one of my PhD supervisors used to say, once you lose supernature, you lose nature too.
Indeed. Indeed.
Let's get to Albury. when we were talking at the windmill, the thought that came to me has since left me. What was the thought?
The state as
oh yeah, that's right. So when we were talking at the windmill, the thought that came to me was that some of the people I've been interested in, the thinkers we've discussed in the past, believed that the state, obviously being a natural society, gets assumed into the life of the church, and the church becomes admixed with the state at the level of the constitution. And when the state, as happened in the 18th and 19th centuries, when the state ousts the church, it doesn't actually become secular. In some way, the religious authority reverts back to the state. The state is the religious authority over natural religion as a natural institution, but if you like, that becomes superseded by its admixture with the church. But when it ousts the church and claims to become secular, it actually becomes hyper-religious, but at a natural level. But it simultaneously, in a secular age, denies that, and so it becomes characterized by a sort of religious frustration. Do you see that happening, or do you have a different way of diagnosing the situation?
It's certainly true that if we believe in such a thing as natural religion, which I think I certainly would, natural religion is the idea of religion as made available to us by reason. Mm-hmm. And it's predicated on the thought that God's existence as creator can be known by reason from created things. Natural religion, if that's the religion that's available, that's not been supplanted by revelation of a supernatural form of religion, a higher end to religion outside this natural life, that would be run by the state. Yeah. So the state is the sort of church of natural religion, should that be what it's on offer.
Indeed.
But that goes with the thought that we have a conception of man as bearing, or humanity as bearing the image of God, this God that's naturally known, and involves a recognition of man as metaphysically distinct from the rest of nature by virtue of its capacity for intellect and will, and for responsiveness to normative power. Mm-hmm. What we're looking at is a form of secularization that denies the metaphysical distinctiveness of man on this model, because it's associated with a process of philosophical naturalization. Yeah. So, to the extent that there is a conception of God, it's radically unlike that involved in natural religion properly understood. So, for example, Hobbes is this naturalizer of human nature. He is saying that the only power operative in human life is this necessitating ordinary causation. At the same time, he reduces God to a sort of limit feature of the material world. He is the omnipotent source of all causal power, going back to the beginning of time, who operates on us only through chains of secondary causation extending through time. And so we have a sort of form of religion, but it's not natural religion as you would understand it. It's a kind of sort of materialist recreation of something like a creator-created relationship. And that's as good as you get. What we have now is a secular state that could not possibly admit its religious role. Now, you say it exists, there is a tension between its secularizing role and its religious role. I suspect that may be true to some extent. I think what survives is its role as teacher
Right.
and witness. I'm more hesitant to think that what's going on is necessarily a form of religion, even in a disguised form. It's become a very, very common thing to claim that the modern state is particularly amongst Christians and Catholics, to say that the modern state is running a kind of form of religion.
Sure.
I think what is clearly true, that it's preaching as witness a story about how human life really should be understood. A story about the bonum commune, which involves a story about how communally we should relate to each other, which could be understood as a form of religion, if you mean by that a public moralism that's highly communal. But I think if you mean by religion something genuinely involving a worship of God, I'm not sure that's going on in any serious sense.
Well, it seems to me that you can talk about natural religion in two ways. You can talk about natural religion in terms of its object, which is God insofar as he can be known independently of revelation. And contemplated or even adored in the way that Aristotle talks about in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, for example. So that is to think about natural religion from the perspective of its object. But I think there's also a way of talking about natural religion which is from the perspective of its origin in us. That there is that we are by nature characterized by a religious impulse, and we can't make sense of our lives and our common lives together unless we are constantly ordering ourselves towards some ultimate overarching meaning of why we're here, and that is routinely going to take on characteristics that are quasi or paraliturgical. That it's routinely going to take on characteristics that are at least imitate acts of worship, and I mean, what Aquinas says right at the beginning of the Summa Theologica is that whilst God can be known by reason, we are inclined, because of the darkness of our intellect, to put in the place of God some kind of creature. But the fact that we're doing that in the first place presupposes that there is this prior inclination towards knowing God and worshipping him. I've got to be honest, I mean, just to bring it down to the mundane a little bit, I think I saw this during the COVID regulations in this country, when the state asked us to go onto our doorsteps, go out of our front doors every Thursday and applaud the sky in honour of the NHS, right? This was a sort of bizarre liturgical or quasi-liturgical action in which we were giving honour to some sort of providential being, you know, and this I think is typical of what you will see, and you'll see it increasingly as the state secularizes.
Yes, I think you're giving a more theistic or deistic reading of those events. Certainly there was a celebration of the community.
Yeah.
But I think there's an important issue here, which is the distinctiveness of religion as a good, which I think is rather important to preserve. It's going to become an issue again when we discuss the distinctive nature of the church and its relation to the state. There is in a certain sort of secular philosophy a tendency to go somewhat in the direction you're describing. The late Ronald Dworkin used religion to mean what is of profound value to us. And so religion was just becoming a general term for value. I don't think that's actually what it is, and general celebrations of value, even at the communal level, shouldn't be mistaken for religion. Religion is actually a very distinctive activity and a very distinctive good, and it precisely involves worship of some sort of creator. And that is, I think, not obviously what's going on.
So Buddhism and Jainism are not really religions in that,
except at best they're highly peripheral and distorted versions of religion, precisely because of their lack of acknowledgement of a creator.
So you would see them more to be practical, philosophical takes?
Yes, I think so. The reason I rather insist on the distinctiveness of religion is because if we're going to think about how religion should be treated and what priority should be given to it, and particularly when a specifically religious legal authority arises, namely in the form of the church, how the church should be related to the state and what it should be responsible for and what the state should be responsible for, it's impossible to make sense of the matter unless we take as the good of religion centrally the worship of God.
The Nordic cults and the Athenians. I mean, it seems.
Well, those are forms of worship of something like gods.
Right.
They're degenerate or very distorted forms of religion, but they're very recognisably forms of worship of some sort of higher being.
Yeah.
Who can often play a at least semi-creative role in relation to human life. And so they're recognisable as perverted forms of religion. But they're perverted forms of something that in its proper form is very, very specifically the worship of God. And who gets authority over that very much depends on the distinctiveness of that good being recognised and understood properly. I mean, one of the reasons why people like Dworkin were very, very keen to shall we say, thin out the notion of religion to cover value in general, was in fact that they wanted to avoid giving distinctive recognition to religion properly understood. They precisely didn't want to preserve the idea of a specifically religious sphere that should get special recognition under law and which might involve a church claiming to be a true church as being given special status because of her care for religion. They wanted to get rid of that sort of, sometimes call it two worlds or two authorities theory completely.
Yeah, religious Platonism.
And so of course, ceasing to make allow that religion is a distinctive good, it's just a form of value in general, understood at a common level, was very convenient to them.
So the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy defines religion as any set of beliefs that pertains to something like the origin, purpose, and destiny of humankind. You would see that to be a way too broad definition.
I think so, yes.
Yeah. And downstream.
Unless you put a lot more content into purpose than I think the dictionary writers meant.
Okay, fine.
If we're just talking about origin, well, I mean, we've all got Darwinian stories about that, for example. They're not obviously a form of religion. Again, Darwin can be celebrated, but I really do think if we lose touch with the idea of the distinctive goodness of the worship of the Creator, we pay a heavy price.
Yes. That's natural religion. But some years ago, you caused a bit of, let's say, shockwaves among interested people when you wrote a 3-part essay for the Josiah's Journal on baptism.
Yeah.
And obviously a major theme of your thought is looking at how principles that can be known through natural reasoning have analogues in thought that pertains to supernature, that pertains to the deposit of the Christian life. And you touched on the principle of baptism. that baptism is that this is the key to understanding the Christian drama, and that also in recent decades there's been a transformation of how we understand baptism. Is that fair?
Yes.
Can you say a little bit about that so that I can understand it better?
Baptism is understood by most people as an introduction into the Christian community.
Right.
And that, of course, is exactly what it is. It gives one membership of the church. But it is going to have various dimensions to it which are less commonly understood or given recognition in the life even of the modern Catholic Church. One is, of course, it's the point at which one receives justifying grace, so that one is let into salvation. One is no longer separated from God simply as a creation, his creation and bearing his image, but becomes his child. So it is a mechanism by which we receive grace in a form that can save us. And it also is a juridical event. It puts one under the jurisdiction of a legal authority. And these two things are quite closely connected because, as I was saying earlier when we were discussing Hobbes and what Hobbes was opposed to, the idea of legal authority that Hobbes was opposed to was precisely the idea of legal authority as a witness, the legal directives of which, and the legal authority of which, facilitate our responsiveness to some form or other of normative power. So the authority of the state enables us to respond to the force of reason as it concerns the good of an entire community, enables us to understand that good and to be motivated by it when we wouldn't otherwise have been capable of it. Baptism puts us under the jurisdiction of a church whose legal authority, and obviously it's other forms of authority as well, and I'll come back to that, but whose distinctively legal authority enables us to respond to and understand supernatural truth and goodness, and channels towards us the force of grace. So this admission into the Christian community is both going to be a metaphysical event. It's a key part to our being responsive to and receptive of a force of grace. And it's associated with a legal authority, the function of which is to enable us to respond to and receive the force of grace. And it puts us, as I say, under the jurisdiction of this legal authority, rather as being born a citizen of a country puts us under the legal authority of a particular state.
Well, I was going to ask you about this because it does seem to be analogous to citizenship, which of course was a Roman concept, but it largely disappeared in Europe and didn't re-emerge until the 18th century, when there was a big push to say that actually Europeans were not subjects to monarchs but citizens, that is to say they had a legal standing rather than a position in relation to a particular ruler. And in fact, British citizenship is still it's a very novel thing, really. And I wonder whether citizenship is a concept that had been superseded by baptism, and that it re-emerged in Europe as states were claiming that the only legal jurisdiction that you could be under was really that of the state rather than any other society like the church. And that's when you get this explosion of the idea of citizenship in the 18th century.
That's an interesting thought. I think I probably want to make a distinction between a full-blooded idea of citizenship, as one gets in the 18th century, and a slightly sort of less meaty idea of being subject to, shall we call it, temporal authority. Mm-hmm. That's clearly available long before then. So, for example, when you get canonical discussions of the legal status of, say, non-Christians, the non-baptized, in the 16th and 17th centuries, they make a very clear distinction between subjection to spiritual jurisdiction, which obviously requires baptism, and subjection to temporal jurisdiction, which is fully a feature of the life of, say, Jews and Muslims in places in Christian states, but which precisely involves a different juridical relationship from that of the baptized to spiritual authority. And there'll be, ambiguous cases where the state is acting towards non-Christians at the behest of the authority over the rulers of the state of the Christian authority, but in ways that seem not to involve any direct spiritual jurisdiction of anyone over the non-Christians. Say where the church is requiring the Christian community to be defended or distanced from non-Christians. So they've got a very clear idea of temporal jurisdiction as something distinct from spiritual jurisdiction, and fully as real, but obviously having a natural rather than a supernatural basis. You may well be right that the idea of citizenship increasingly comes to involve the idea of temporal jurisdiction as the only one that really matters. Because one's role as a citizen is what is of fundamental importance.
But I don't know, by the way. I must admit, perhaps I ought not to admit, I've never had this thought until now. But it suddenly occurred to me as you were talking that this move from being a subject to a person and a legal entity is a particularly 18th century idea, and there's a massive enthusiasm for it right at the end.
Well, certainly the idea of citizenship, say, in France, is associated with something Jews, Protestants and Catholics can all share, and it's somehow determinative in a way that they're at a juridical level, in a way that their religious identity no longer is.
Exactly,
So yes, that's clearly happening. But as I say, long before then, there is a very clearly worked out idea of legal authority taking different forms and playing in every case an analogous role, that of making available to and channeling a kind of normative power. In relation to a bonum commune at the natural level, or in relation to the supernatural and the spiritual level.
You and I are both practicing Roman Catholics. You have, I suppose, in certain circles, become known as something of a critic of the state of the church in the modern age. Most people, I think, would accept that, and people outside the church as well as those who are practicing members of the faithful, most people would accept that the church is in a very unhealthy situation at the moment. Why does the church look the way it does?
I think one of the central problems is to do with this changing understanding of baptism. Baptism clearly, as traditionally conceived in the terms that I've suggested, deeply divides one group of humanity from another. It leaves the baptized subject to a very distinctive form of authority and a very distinctive kind of directive power of grace, that fundamentally affects their destination, takes you to heaven. it's associated, as I say, it's a visible marker, which certainly doesn't leave all the unbaptized completely outside this world. I mean, they certainly won't be subject to the juridical authority. Grace may still be available to them, but there won't be the guaranteed availability that comes with the traditional theology of baptism. As Pius XII put it so well in Mystici Corporis, the unbaptized and even non-Catholics, by being deprived of various sacraments, are no longer so sure of their ultimate salvation.
Right.
So with the sacramental structure of the Church, and baptism in particular, comes subjection to a jurisdiction and an assurance of certain means to salvation, which would not otherwise be available. With that comes with a very clear conception of the world of the unbaptized as disadvantaged in the following respect: they are under an illicit dominion of Christ's enemy, the devil.
Right.
So the prince of this world. So that there is a confrontational spiritual dimension to baptism. To be baptized is to be part of a community that is in a state of war, spiritual war, with someone who has dominion over the rest of humanity. An illicit dominion, but a real dominion all the same.
So this is Christ saying, you are Peter, on this rock I build my church, and the gates of hell won't prevail. That is to say, the borders of Satan's principality will not withstand this kind of introduction of grace into the world, something like that. Right? And of course, the evil one is referred to as the prince of this world, and so on throughout the scriptures.
Oh, very much, yes.
Yes.
And traditionally, baptism was accompanied by very explicit exorcisms.
Right, of course. Yeah.
As was the when natural elements were used liturgically as holy water or holy oil or whatever. Again, you would have very explicit exorcisms of the elements. Mm-hmm. You're withdrawing them from the dominion of Satan to put them to the use of the community of the baptized. Yeah. That means that you are refusing to compromise with the non-Catholic world, because the non-Catholic world will inevitably, whilst it remains outside the world of the baptized, be subject to pressures, particularly the negative impact of the fall on our receptiveness to natural reason. Again, we come to another normative power that will lead to enmity and fight of a spiritual sort.
Breath and life is ended. Your breath goes forth and life begins. Your hand renews the face of earth. Your praise, my whole life I will sing.
So, baptism, if I've understood you correctly, it is as you put it, a mechanism which distinguishes the redeemed world from the world that is still under some kind of diabolical jurisdiction. And I think you're alluding to the notion that in the modern age, the Church has lost sight of this what would you call it, a tension that exists, or maybe that's a too soft a way of putting it, but there is a fundamental conflict going on between that which has been brought under the kingship of Jesus Christ and that which remains within the principality of the devil.
Yes, it's been this sense of a division has been replaced by a desire for dialogic harmony.
Right.
So that either you fall silent about grace, or you no longer take grace as marking a division, a normative power that some are responsive to in a way that others aren't, and turn it into a sort of, shall we say, a sort of general baptism of nature, going beyond visible baptism, that leaves the sacraments, the visible sacraments of the church, baptism included, no more than a kind of sacramental theatre, something that acts as a sign of Christ's saving mission, but no longer actually is involved in the transmission of a distinctive form of power. And that means that you're trying to arrive at a state of harmony with an unredeemed world within which one must remain in spiritual conflict. And that's going to be a vain enterprise. What it's going to involve in the end is constantly trying to compromise in the mission of the church to realise the harmony that has not yet come your way. So one of the principal hopes of the Declaration of Religious Liberty, which effectively ended the church's attempt to run Christian states, was that there should be added harmony with the non-Christian world and the non-Christian and the state in particular. So the church could live in harmony with the state, even if the state was no longer explicitly Catholic and explicitly committed to the church. Of course, there's been no such harmony. I mean, tensions between church and state have actually multiplied to include fundamental disagreements about family structure. And the effect has been for people inside the church to attempt to compromise with the secular world, including in things like family structure. Hence, of course, all the problems arising in relation to amoris laetitia, blessing of gay relationships, and all the rest that the current synod and synodality seems to be designed to facilitate.
But hasn't the church managed that situation by essentially saying, well, look, we'll accept that we are no longer the life-giving principle, the to use the Leonine language that you've referred to before, the soul within the body of the state. We'll accept that we're no longer that, but at least let us be a kind of club within the jurisdiction of the state. And as each club has its various codes of conduct and its commitments and so on, and its constitution, that's what we have, and we will obey the state in everything as long as you give us those freedoms.
Well, first of all, to be a voluntary society, which of course is the view of the church. I mean, you've described the project of turning the church into a voluntary society, which is a view of the church that Leo XIII specifically condemned.
Yeah.
And it involves denial of her sovereign legislative authority over the baptized, which clearly is not the authority of a voluntary society. It's the authority of a quasi-state at the supernatural level. Once you abandon that, the state won't leave you alone.
Right.
It will continue to interfere in your life, and if you, on your side, continue to be possessed of the idea that some harmony with the unbaptized world is possible, you will continue to be driven to compromise in your message to achieve the harmony from your side that the unbaptized world is not offering you from its side.
So like states that are currently putting pressure on the church to have some kind of quasi-marriage ceremony for same-sex couples. Right?
Exactly.
Right. But it's...
Or the church internally pressuring itself to move in that direction so that it will live at peace with the non-Christian secular society.
Yeah. But it does seem that since Leo XIII, I'm pretty sure that John Paul II developed some kind of canonically recognised process by which people could declare formally that they were no longer members of the Catholic Church, despite being baptised. And this seems to me to concede territory to the notion that actually the Church is a kind of voluntary society and ought to be thought more as a club. Or
you're absolutely right that at the level of the Church's management, the level of popes and bishops, the conception of the Church as a kind of voluntary society became very prevalent.
Right.
You can see it in the writings of Joseph Ratzinger. And it's important to note this was not the view of Paul VI. Paul VI was very open about the coercive authority of the Church, as was Maritain, who Paul VI was Jacques Maritain's disciple.
Great admirer.
Both had a very, very strong conception of the Church as a sovereign legislative authority with this coercive jurisdiction over the baptised. It's just that they thought that it no longer needed for church-state harmony the involvement of the state.
Right.
And what has happened very rapidly after that is a change in the conception of the Church herself.
Right.
At the level of what I call official theology. There's been no magisterial declaration that the Church is a voluntary society. Indeed, you've got a code of canon law that puts the baptised under a coercive jurisdiction, leaving crimes such as heresy and apostasy, genuine crimes, punishable under canon law. So you're not allowed to leave. Not in the code. So you've got this canonical structure, canon law being the law of the Church, as civil law is the law of the state, that treats the Church as a sovereign legal authority. But you've got a kind of quasi non-magisterial teaching. You know, no one obligates you to believe it, but it's what people tell you. It's part of the party line.
Sure.
This official theology that treats the Church like a voluntary society. And that, of course, means that this legal structure that in traditional Catholic theology is about transmitting the force of grace to the baptised as the legal authority of the state. It facilitates the transmission of the force of reason concerning the bonum communi to the subjects of the state or citizens. This legal structure is essentially being de-recognised as of significance. And that, of course, goes with the decreased understanding of grace as something characterising the visible life of the Church in a way that it doesn't characterise life outside the Church, and the transformation of the whole sacramental system of the Church into a kind of sacramental theatre, a display system, rather than something that actually brings things about and changes things, actually transmits the power.
So is this because the Church, at the level of its officials, truly, on the whole, believes in the secularist project? Or is it because it's on survival mode and it has recognised that secularism is now so aggressive in the post-Christian epoch that it is just simply trying to negotiate a state of affairs that will allow the Church to permit its existence?
I think it's both.
Right.
I think you will have people who think that actually it makes no difference to your salvation whether you actually receive baptism or actually go to confession or actually receive the Eucharist. And there are also people who've gone into survival mode and are desperate to enjoy a degree of approval from civil society that wouldn't be available to them if they still tried to run the Church of Pius XII or Pius X.
I mean, it seems to me more the former, I have to say. When I hear reports of what very prominent bishops are saying in Germany, in the lowlands, on the continent, in the Catholic heartlands, really, about, you know, the age of progress, that we're moving into a new age of egalitarianism, and that suddenly, you know, women are going to take a leading role in the Church, which, you know, whatever that might mean, what it clearly means for them is that there's something inherently unjust about only men being eligible for holy orders, for example. There seems to be this sense that whatever the church has been down the ages, it has been captive to very serious injustices, and that now it's being emancipated by the forces of liberalism and progress.
I think it's both, and I think it depends what part of the church you're talking about. I think if you're going around the Rhine, then it's effectively a willing surrender. If you're looking at a mildly conservative bishop in North America, it could be much more like a sense of survival. A further point to make, I think, though, is that it is perfectly true that the church has been involved in historical injustices.
Sure.
So whilst it's absolutely, I think, part of Catholic doctrine that the church is a sovereign legal authority, potestas, as Leo XIII put it, that doesn't mean that every exercise in the past of a legitimate authority over the baptized was just. I've gone to some lengths to describe just how brutally unjust the regulation of Christian conduct towards the Jewish people was in the past, which very importantly, I think, damaged what is very central to the church's mission, her mission to convert the Jewish people.
Right, yeah.
It's a complex situation. But I think there's a distinction between a self-criticism of the church that's put forward in a way that's consistent with her clearly historic and magisterial teaching about our own nature, and one that effectively abandons that teaching and turns her into a voluntary society that's a bit behind the times and needs to get with the secular programme.
This distinction that you make, which we haven't covered in detail, but I'm familiar with it through our conversations, and you alluded to it a moment ago, this distinction between magisterial theology and official theology, that the church in every age conveys what it has received from God's own revelation, but it does it through the medium of its hierarchy, and they have, if I can put it this way, their own take on it. And that is going to warp sometimes, sometimes for the better, so that it has better didactic power, and sometimes it's going to undermine it's sometimes going to undermine that for which it's meant to be a conduit. It seems to me the great trouble with seeing it in this way is that if that's true, it's almost like there's an imperative on every Catholic to be a scholar of magisterial theology. Otherwise, you're relying on what's essentially a faulty conduit.
There's that risk. Right. I think, to be honest, there is a degree to which those who live within the sacramental structure of the church and go with the party line will be looked after. I mean, otherwise, Christ's promise to the church really would be rather empty. But I think it's very important for the good of the church that a far more critical attitude be taken towards the theological opinions and day-to-day opinionation of popes and bishops. Because otherwise long-lasting damage can go unremedied. I mean, a lot of this rather ghastly medieval canonical legislation in relation to the Jewish people went unchallenged for centuries. And the damage done to the church's mission lasted for centuries. So there is a price to be paid, very often, I think, by third parties. So I think an excessively obsequious attitude to episcopal authority is probably a mistake.
Right.
But it's a mistake that the church has long survived.
As you know, I conducted quite a lot of research on the 18th century conservatives, those who were responding to the French Revolution and to what they thought would be its consequences. And I looked at people obviously like Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre, Chateaubriand, Louis de Bonnard, and later figures like Cortes, and also back to the English tradition with Coleridge and other figures of the Romantic movement. One of the things that I'm very concerned about is the secularization of conservatism. Knowing what I know about the origins of conservatism, their main arguments in the 18th century was that the secularization of the once Christian lands of Europe was going to be the end of Europe if this was able to prevail. And it seems to me that one of the great tricks of the devil, as it were, is to assume the name conservatism to essentially mean early liberal secularist principles. So what would you say are the consequences of what we've been talking about throughout the day today for the conservative movement in Europe?
Well, conservatism is associated with at least three things that I think are highly contingent and which I think can be detached from. One is a concern for preservation of the past. Second is a suspicion of reason. The third is with nostalgia for various forms of rule by elites and monarchies and the like. Now, you're absolutely right, I think, that if there's anything of value in conservatism, it's far more to do with the preservation of Christianity and of a Christian society and a Christian polity, at least as ideals. So, when it comes to the past, if you've been the Senator Symmachus wanting to restore the goddess Victory in the Senate House in Rome, you were, by that meaning, a conservative, but of course you were an enemy of Christianity. Mm-hmm. I've already said that actually if we understand how reason works, conservatism shouldn't be sceptical about reason at all. It should just get a proper understanding of what reason involves. Yeah. When it comes to forms of government, one should remember that social elites can be as anti-Christian as any. We can live under a technocratic secularist elite, and some of it can look very traditional in other respects perfectly well. What I think is worth preserving in conservatism is an understanding that the real source of the problems facing modern European society is not some sort of mythical Hobbseian moment or some sort of spurious atomization or changing in nature of the state and of its population from what they once were. States and people remain as they once were. The real source of the problem is the fall. And the problem is about how to re-establish the proper responsiveness of human beings to the force of reason, at the very least, which is going to involve the healing of reason by grace. And so it's a project about re-Christianization.
But is your characterization of conservatism true? That's.
Well, what is value? I mean, I'm not a friend of conservatism if it comes as a secular creed that is about worshipping sentiment at the expense of reason, about venerating the past just because it's the past, or venerating elite rule just because it's a form of elite rule.
Well,
that's worthless.
This is the trouble. I think there are certain caricatures of conservatism which don't correspond to the writings of the conservatives. So Edmund Burke, in his abridgment of English history, he is very keen to denigrate the past when he's talking about the pre-evangelized Britons.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And the terrible ways that they behaved.
I'm not criticising Burke, I'm criticising a very common model of conservatism that you'll get in the secular culture.
Right.
So you'll get someone like David Brooks talking about Hume as a model of conservatism.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
So that is precisely a worship of sentiment at the expense of reason.
Agreed.
A tendency on pragmatic grounds to favour the past, and a hostility to equality as a social value that seems to lack any convincing basis in a satisfactory theory of what states are really for. More to do with preserving a degree of convenient stability. Essentially, what one has to understand is that the state is in the business of witnessing to the bonum commune. It's not just a coordinative device. It's doing that so as to enable us better to understand and respond to the force of reason as it concerns the bonum commune. And it will only carry out that function properly if it is operating, I think, ultimately in a Christian form. Otherwise, you're going to be dealing with an erroneous and unreliable witness that's going to do quite a bit of damage along the way, while fundamentally doing the job that all states do. What sort of form of government is required to remedy the disaster of a secular state in a fallen world, I think is a very interesting question. It's a very important feature of the political theory of the early modern Jesuits that they were heavily committed to democracy as a very important and thoroughly viable political form. Indeed, Suarez thinks that the original form of human government was democracy.
I know, yeah.
Now, he had lots of strange reasons for thinking that, but if one looks at the state as a kind of educative witness that educates human beings through their involvement in political institutions, then one of the benefits of democratic forms is that they involve the population as a whole in political institutions and the operation of them. Now, I'm not saying that's an unqualified good, but it's not obviously worse than systems of government that retain decision-making in some sort of elite detached from the rest of the people, whether technocratic or otherwise.
Well, shouldn't it be Christ the Prime Minister rather than Christ the King, if that were the case?
Oh, well, kingship is just a general term, I think, in this theory for political authority. But the form that it takes, as Leo XIII rightly pointed out in the Ralliement, is entirely a matter of what works. And here we're looking at how best to foster understanding of and responsiveness to the bonum commune in the population as a whole.
That line in Leo XIII, when he says that we are free to agree or disagree over the best form of government in the abstract, but in the concrete, it is simply what is agreed upon over time by the given community, which I think is what you're referring to. That is almost entirely, almost word for word, lifted from a paragraph from Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke. And I think Leo XIII was an admirer of Edmund Burke, as was his predecessors.
No, it may well be, but it's also a very recognisable feature of early modern Jesuit political theory. One of the reasons why a number of their works were burnt by James I's public hangman.
Well, of course, Edmund Burke was educated by Jesuits in a hedge school in Ireland, illegally as a child. But I, if I may, I'd like to question some of these characterizations of conservatism, because it seems to me that it's true that conservatism has an inclination to respect, if you like, the elites of society. But that is only in as much as they are part of an organic hierarchy and they protect high culture. When they stop doing that, conservatism becomes a very anti-elite aggressive force, as we've seen in recent times, when it's the liberal establishment that wants to protect the elites, and it's the conservatives who are calling them into question. In terms of a worship of the past, conservatism, I think, has a tendency to be very critical of the past insofar as it departs from the things that it deems to be true. But what conservatism instinctively assumes is that the truth is over time embodied in the world, and where it is, it must be preserved and conserved and respected. And so I think we have to be careful. We have to have a subtle diagnosis of what conservatism really is.
I think I'm much more sceptical than you about the thought that wisdom is embodied over time in the world.
Yes.
I think the effects of the fall would suggest that that cannot be relied upon. What is true is that human nature, by virtue of being human nature that survives the fall, will not completely depart from the truth.
Yeah.
But it will be subject to non-rational lapses, which will take different forms in different periods, unless there is a counteracting force that's going to be normative in nature. So, we are particularly bad at family structure in our secular culture, but other cultures have been bad in other directions. And of course, quite a lot of these badnesses have existed in some tension with Christianity itself.
Sure.
So I think there are very, very strong grounds for saying that the past, through the cultivation of human habits, matters very much. But it can be as much a source of error as a source of truth.
Well, okay. I'm not going to disagree with you, but I hope we can both agree that there is this patristic theme that outside the baptized world, in the unredeemed world, nonetheless God's providential care is always operating so as to prepare people for baptism. And this was a very important theme in the writings of both the Latin and Greek fathers, that, for example, the Pax Romana was a preparation for the Church Universal, that the Athenian Academy and Hellenistic wisdom was a preparation for theologizing and knowing the ultimate good for which we have been created. There's a very, very strong pedigree in the Church of seeing God's providential operation, even outside the church, let alone within it, down its history and its story.
So that may, of course, operate through change as well as continuity.
Sure.
And it will depend. I think that, by and large, conservatism as a modern phenomenon is oriented towards the solution in a way that secular liberalism tends not to be, especially when secular liberalism is based on a naturalised picture, an aggressively naturalised picture of human nature, and an associatedly naturalised picture of how legal and political institutions work. And again, I'm not sure we're disagreeing that much, but I think that conservatism can take a naturalising and secularised form itself.
Agreed.
It would involve very much the same machinery as the so-called liberal opposition. One of course, most important figures in this sort of secularisation of conservatism, antecedents invoked by secularised conservatives, at any rate, is David Hume.
Yeah, and Bolingbroke.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I suppose what I want to say is something like this, that what conservatism as a movement in response to Enlightenment rationalism and the transposition of Enlightenment rationalism into political movements, namely revolution, what conservatism offers is some kind of account of human nature as something that is realised through tradition, through an ongoing handed down account of what human flourishing looks like, that it's communal, that it's fallen and prone to vice, that there are natural societies in which human nature naturally flourishes. All of these are conservative commitments. So it seems to be giving a kind of account of human nature which is co-natural with the reception of revelation. I'm not sure if there is another approach which has that kind of connaturality to revelation. And I think that's also why, the Curia and the popes have condemned explicitly by name socialism, communism, liberalism, fascism, Nazism, every single modern approach to politics that from the last 250 years, it has condemned, apart from conservatism. I mean, surely that should tell us something about how Roman Catholics like you and me should think of conservatism.
Weakly, yes, perhaps. I wonder whether that really shows more than an attention to more immediate and aggressive opponents of the time. I mean, I think if conservatism is going to work as a serious programme for understanding the political in a way that can remedy our situation, at the very least it needs to be accompanied by a serious metaphysics of human nature,
Agreed.
particularly of the forms of power operative in and through human nature, which on the whole it tends not to be, in my experience. It's tended to be metaphysically weak, and I think that's a serious problem with it.
Well, I think that's certainly, I'm happy to concede that point to you if we're talking exclusively about the Anglo tradition. But I don't think you could say that so much about thinkers. I certainly don't think you could say that about Maistre, certainly not Donoso Cortes, and probably not of Bernard. And there's always been within conservative circles a desire to separate these two, that the Continentals are religious fanatics and the Anglo-conservatives are sort of mundane, sensible people. And I think these traditions are much closer, actually, than that the true Anglo-conservatives, like Burke, like Dr. Johnson, are much closer to the continental tradition than, your American Legacy Foundation conservative wants to admit. And once you start going into those texts, I think there's a very rich and highly Thomistic anthropology and metaphysics going on there, which ought to be acknowledged.
I know them less well. What is true is that you will get very little as sophisticated as the theories of normative power in people like Molyneux and Suarez, who of course would never have described themselves as conservatives. They would have not known what you meant.
Well, sure. I mean, the term was invented by Chateaubriand.
That's right, and I suspect that's probably why, whilst not unsympathetic to conservatism, I would be hesitant about presenting myself as first and foremost a conservative. I'd much rather present myself as a politically interested Catholic metaphysician. And I'll leave it at that.